Imagine an empire stretching for thousands of miles along the spine of the world, a civilization so advanced it could perform brain surgery and build roads through the most unforgiving mountains on Earth. This was Tawantinsuyu, the Inca Empire, a tapestry woven with threads of gold, stone, and absolute power. Yet, like any great tapestry, a single pulled thread can cause the entire thing to unravel. We are about to witness how the most powerful empire in the Americas was brought to its knees not by a foreign invasion alone, but by a catastrophic family feud that erupted at the worst possible moment in history. This is a story of two brothers, a crown, and a collision of worlds that would change the continent forever. To truly understand the sheer scale of this tragedy, how a kingdom of millions could fall to a few hundred outsiders, you need to follow us into the heart of the Andes. So make sure you subscribe and activate notifications, because the epic you're about to see is a stark reminder that the most dangerous enemy often comes from within. Let's journey back to the year 1527, to a mountaintop palace where the fate of an empire hangs in the balance, poisoned not by steel, but by suspicion. The air in the high Andes was thin, but the power of the Sapa Inca, Huayna Capac, was absolute. He was a conqueror, a living god who had pushed the borders of his empire to their zenith, from modern-day Colombia to Chile. His rule was the Golden Age. But an unseen enemy was creeping north, a phantom illness that traveled faster than any army. Smallpox. It cared nothing for gods or emperors. The disease struck the royal court with merciless efficiency, and soon Huayna Capac was dead. Crucially, his chosen heir, Ninan Kuyochi, died with him, creating a power vacuum of terrifying proportions. Suddenly, the empire had no clear successor. Into this void stepped two sons, two half-brothers with vastly different claims and ambitions. In the ancient capital of Cusco, there was Huáscar, the son of the emperor's principal wife. By all traditional rights, he was the legitimate heir. Let us picture him, surrounded by the mummified remains of his ancestors, the weight of tradition heavy on his shoulders. He was the establishment. Far to the north, in the newly conquered city of Quito, was Atahualpa. He was the son of a secondary wife, but he was his father's favorite, a brilliant and charismatic general who had spent his life on the campaign trail. The empire's finest armies were loyal to him, not to a distant politician in Cusco. Here, we see the stage set for a classic confrontation, the heartland versus the frontier, legitimacy versus raw power. The first move in this deadly game came from Huáscar. Feeling insecure in his new role, he demanded that Atahualpa travel to Cusco to pay homage. It was a test of loyalty, a summons meant to put the popular general in his place. For Atahualpa, however, it smelled like a trap. His father's most trusted generals warned him that to enter Cusco was to walk into his own execution. He refused the summons. This single act of defiance was the spark that ignited the flames of civil war. The kingdom cleaved in two. Messengers became spies, and diplomatic gifts were replaced with sharpened weapons. The intricate network of roads that had united the empire now served to move armies bent on its destruction. The war that followed was a brutal 5-year ordeal. It was a conflict that pitted Inca against Inca, province against province. Atahualpa's seasoned generals, men like Quizquiz and Chalcuchamac, were masters of mountain warfare. They systematically pushed south, their campaign a relentless march of victory and vengeance. They fought with a ferocity that shocked even the war-weary inhabitants of the Andes. Finally, on the outskirts of Cusco itself, the two sides met for a decisive battle. Huáscar's forces were crushed, and he himself was captured, a humiliation from which his authority would never recover. Atahualpa, the warrior from the north, had won. He was now the undisputed Sapa Inca, the sole ruler of Tawantinsuyu. As he sat in the city of Cajamarca, consolidating his power and awaiting his own formal coronation, he was the master of a broken and bloodied empire. And it was at that exact moment, as the victor surveyed his fractured prize, that strange reports began to arrive from the coast. A handful of bearded men, clad in shining metal and riding giant beasts, had just stepped ashore. In the stone heart of Cusco, silence was a weapon. The news of Atahualpa's defiance arrived not with a thunderclap, but as a chilling whisper that snaked through the corridors of power, extinguishing the sacred fires of deference. For a ruler whose authority was divinely ordained, this was more than insubordination, it was blasphemy. Here we can almost feel the collective breath being held by the city's nobility. Huáscar, the anointed Sapa Inca, found himself staring into an abyss. To his court, the priests and the ancient aristocratic families, his brother in Quito was no longer just a rival. He was a cancer growing on the northern frontier, a threat that had to be excised before it consumed the entire body of the empire. Surrounded by the silent judgment of his mummified ancestors, Huáscar made the only choice a god-king could make. He declared war. Far to the north, the mood was entirely different. Let us travel to Atahualpa's sprawling military camp outside Quito, a city of hardened veterans and ambitious commanders. There was no gilded pomp here, only the cold, pragmatic calculus of survival. Atahualpa and his generals, men like the cunning Quizquiz and the fearsome Chalcuchamac, had spent their lives securing the empire's borders, not navigating the intricate politics of the capital. They were warriors, not courtiers. They saw Huáscar's summons for what it was, a velvet-gloved invitation to a public execution. Their loyalty was to the man who had shared their hardships and bled with them on the battlefield, not to a distant brother who they believed saw them as provincial upstarts. For them, obedience was suicide. Defiance was the only path forward. The first armies to march were Huáscar's. Led by his general Atac, a man known as the Fox, a massive force moved north from Cusco, a wave of imperial authority meant to crush the rebellion in a single decisive blow. They were confident, representing the legitimate power of the empire's heartland. We follow their path along the Great Inca Road, a marvel of engineering now serving as a conduit for civil war. They expected to meet a disorganized rabble. Instead, they met the hardened legions of the north near Chimborazo. What unfolded on those high plains was not a battle, but a masterclass in tactical deception. Atahualpa's commanders feigned a chaotic retreat, luring the overconfident Atac and his army into a narrow, treacherous valley. Once the trap was sprung, the slaughter was methodical. The seasoned northern troops who knew every rock and ravine fell upon Huáscar's bewildered army from all sides. The disciplined warriors of the capital were thrown into a panic, their formations shattering under the relentless assault. The Fox, Atac, was captured alive. The message Atahualpa sent back to Cusco was not written on knotted strings, but in blood. In an act of shocking brutality that would define the entire conflict, he had Atac's skull hollowed out, lined with gold, and fashioned into a ceremonial drinking cup. This was not merely an act of war. It was a visceral statement. The old traditions were dead. This would be a contest without honor, a fight to the bitter end. With this gruesome victory, the psychological tide of the war turned. Atahualpa's forces, once seen as a regional rebellion, now appeared unstoppable, imbued with a fearsome momentum. They began to press southward, their numbers swelling with new recruits drawn to a winner. The conflict that Huáscar had intended as a swift punishment had instead unleashed a ferocious beast that was now marching deliberately toward his own throne. We are now witnessing the empire beginning to cannibalize itself as province turned against province and brother against brother, utterly oblivious to the pale, bearded strangers who were, at that very moment, making their final preparations to sail into this perfectly orchestrated chaos. Before the brothers drew their battle lines, before the first spear was thrown in anger, the Inca Empire was attacked by a foe it could not see and did not understand. Let us turn our gaze away from the grand theater of politics for a moment and look at the microscopic assassin that paved the way for the entire tragedy. It was an enemy that traveled on breath and touch, an invisible conqueror that arrived years before the Spanish, moving silently down the vast network of roads that were the empire's circulatory system. This plague, what we now know as smallpox, was not just a disease. For the Inca, it was a cosmological crisis, a sign that the gods themselves had turned their faces away. We must understand that in the Inca worldview, the health of the Sapa Inca was directly tied to the health of the empire. He was the son of the sun, the linchpin connecting the human world to the divine. His vitality guaranteed the harvest, the strength of the army, and the stability of the cosmos. So when a mysterious sickness began to sweep through the northern provinces, it was more than a medical emergency. It was a terrifying omen. Victims would be seized by a raging fever, their bodies soon erupting in foul pustules. In a world without knowledge of germs, this could only be interpreted as a supernatural assault. Priests made frantic sacrifices, but the sickness only spread, a creeping fog of death that defied all prayers and rituals. Now, let us journey to the royal encampment near Quito, where the great Emperor Huayna Capac was celebrating his recent military triumphs. Imagine the scene. The most powerful man in the Americas, a living deity surrounded by his court, suddenly struck down by an incomprehensible illness. The same fever, the same agonizing spots that had decimated commoners, now ravaged the body of the god king himself. The panic that must have gripped his inner circle is difficult to fathom. The sun was being extinguished. As he lay dying, Huayna Capac made a desperate attempt to secure the future. He named his favorite son, Ninan Cuyochi, as his successor. It was a logical choice, an attempt to maintain stability. But the phantom enemy was not finished. Messengers were dispatched to Cusco to confirm the choice with the priests, as was tradition. By the time they returned with a favorable omen, it was already too late. Ninan Cuyochi had also succumbed to the disease. In the span of a few days, the Inca Empire had lost not only its emperor, but his chosen heir as well. A clear line of succession, the very bedrock of imperial stability, had been utterly shattered. What the plague left behind was a void, a vacuum of power filled with a storm of whispers and fear. It was this biological catastrophe that created the ambiguity, pitting Huáscar's claim of legitimacy in Cusco against Atahualpa's claim of military power in Quito. The unseen enemy had set the board perfectly, leaving two ambitious brothers to tear apart what was left of their father's legacy, completely unaware that a far more tangible threat was already sailing toward their shores. The echoes of Atac's demise, carried by shell-shocked survivors and horrified messengers, cascaded through the valleys toward Cusco, poisoning the very wells of imperial confidence. The golden skull cup was more than a trophy. It was a declaration that this war would not be fought by the established rules of engagement. Here we witness a fundamental clash of philosophies. In Cusco, Huáscar, cocooned by the rigid ceremony of the court, responded with brute force. He levied vast new armies from the southern provinces, conscripting tens of thousands of farmers and artisans who were loyal to the idea of the capital, but untested in the crucible of real combat. His strategy was one of numbers, a belief that the sheer weight of legitimacy could crush the northern insurgency. He was a king playing a grand game of chess, moving immense but clumsy pieces across the board. Far to the north, Atahualpa played a different game entirely. He was a hunter, patient and lethal. While he remained in the strategic rear, he unleashed his two most formidable commanders, Quizquiz and Chalcuchamac, seasoned veterans who understood the rhythms of mountain warfare better than anyone alive. They were his twin blades, slicing southward not in a single massive front, but in a series of swift, brutal campaigns. Let us follow their progress. They did not just defeat armies, they dismantled them. They used terror as a weapon, making examples of resistant cities to ensure the swift surrender of the next. They turned local rivalries to their advantage, promising power to those who would betray Huáscar. Theirs was a modern war of speed, psychology, and relentless pressure, and Huáscar's traditional legions proved tragically unprepared for it. The final, desperate gambit came from Huáscar himself. Seeing his territory shrink and his authority crumble, he made the fateful decision to lead his final great army in person. It was a move born of desperation, an attempt to rally his flagging forces with the divine presence of the Sapa Inca. Near the hills of Quipaipan, just a day's march from the sanctuary of Cusco, the two forces met. We can almost hear the desperate orders shouted over the din of battle as Huáscar's massive but poorly coordinated army surged forward. For a moment, it seemed their sheer numbers might prevail. But Quizquiz and Chalcuchamac were masters of the terrain and the human mind. They executed another of their signature feigned retreats, a calculated maneuver to stretch the enemy lines and sow confusion. Huáscar's commanders, eager for a decisive victory, charged headlong into the trap. As their formations broke apart in the chaotic pursuit, Atahualpa's elite troops, hidden in the surrounding hills and ravines, descended upon them like an avalanche. The imperial army was not just defeated, it was annihilated. In the ensuing pandemonium, a small squad of northern warriors identified the royal litter. They swarmed it, cutting down the royal guard and pulling the son of the sun to the ground. Huáscar, the legitimate emperor, the divine heart of the empire, was captured. We stand witness to a moment that should have been impossible, a living god, bound and shamed, now a mere prisoner. For Atahualpa, the news meant total victory. The brutal civil war was over. He had won the entire world. The victory at Quipaipan was not an end, but a beginning. For the citizens of Cusco, the news of their king's capture was a cosmological collapse, the sky itself cracking open. Into this fractured reality marched the northern generals, Quizquiz and Chalcuchamac. We are now entering the imperial capital not with liberators, but with executioners carrying orders from a distant master. Atahualpa, from his new seat of power in Cajamarca, understood a fundamental truth of absolute rule. A wounded enemy is more dangerous than a dead one. He did not simply want the crown. He wanted to eradicate any memory of his brother's right to it. What followed was not a celebration of victory, but a surgical and merciless cleansing of the body politic. Let us walk the hallowed streets of Cusco, now slick with a terror that was colder than the mountain air. Quizquiz, the architect of this purge, began his work. The first to be summoned were Huáscar's principal wives and his many children. They were rounded up from their palaces, their pleas and confusion ignored. We are now observers to an act of systematic dynastic annihilation. They were not simply killed. They were executed in a brutal public spectacle. a clear and terrifying message to anyone who might harbor loyalty to the fallen king. The goal was to sever every single branch of Huáscar's bloodline, to ensure no son or grandson could ever rise to become a symbol of rebellion. The river of noble Inca blood that flowed through the capital's gutters was a testament to Atahualpa's cold resolve. This symphony of organized violence did not stop with family. Chalcuchamac, the hammer to Quisquisa's scalpel, hunted down every general, every high priest, and every court official who had supported Huáscar's claim. Loyalty was now a death sentence. The complex bureaucracy that had run the empire for a century was dismantled person by person. Even the mummified bodies of Huáscar's royal ancestors were dragged from their sacred chambers and burned in the public square, an act of such profound sacrilege it would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. Here, we must pause and understand the chilling logic at play. This was not chaos. It was a calculated political reset, erasing the past to build a new future exclusively around Atahualpa. And what of Huáscar himself? He was kept alive, a ghost in his own kingdom. Atahualpa's generals understood that his death would be too quick, too merciful. Instead, they forced him to watch. We can only imagine the torment of the captive king, bound in ropes, made to witness the methodical destruction of his family, his court, his history, and his legacy. Each execution he was forced to see was another blow, a psychological dismantling that was far more complete than any battlefield defeat. He was no longer a god, no longer a king. He was a living monument to his own failure, a tool to legitimize Atahualpa's absolute power. When the killing finally subsided, Cusco was a city silenced by fear. The empire was unified, yes, but it was a unity forged in trauma. The southern provinces, the heartland of Tawantinsuyu, were now an occupied territory, their nobility slaughtered and their spirit broken. Atahualpa had won the throne, but he had inherited an empire drained of its lifeblood, its internal bonds of loyalty and tradition deliberately severed. He sat in the north, the undisputed Sapa Inca, master of all he surveyed, completely unaware that the few hundred bearded men who had landed on his shores were about to test the foundations of his hollowed-out prize. The silence that descended upon Cusco was not one of peace, but of suffocation. We are moving now through a city that has lost its soul, its sacred geography redrawn by terror. The Golden Sun Temple, the Coricancha, still stands, but its divine light seems diminished, its purpose questioned. For the ordinary citizen, the world has been inverted. The priests who interpreted the will of the heavens have been executed, the nobles who administered justice have vanished, and the divine emperor who guaranteed the cosmic order is now a chained captive. Imagine the psychological shockwave. This was a society built on a foundation of absolute certainty, and that foundation has just been pulverized. The northern generals did not simply conquer a city, they broke its reality. Quisquiz and Chalcuchamac now ruled as military governors, their authority absolute and their methods brutally efficient. Let us observe their new form of administration. It was a government run from the point of a spear. They commandeered the storehouses, controlling the flow of food and cloth, the very currency of life in the empire. They installed their own loyal officers in every key position, creating a new power structure that answered only to Atahualpa. We see here not a transition of power, but an occupation. The intricate network of local allegiances and family ties that had bound Cusco together for centuries was systematically dismantled. The capital was no longer the heart of the empire. It had become its most heavily guarded prison, a place where a misplaced word or a mournful glance could be a death warrant. The most profound destruction, however, was aimed at memory itself. Atahualpa's decree from the north was simple. The reign of Huáscar was to be erased as if it had never been. We are now witness to an act of cultural vandalism on a grand scale. Squads of northern soldiers went from palace to temple, collecting the quipus, the complex knotted cords that served as the empire's archives. These were not just accounting tools. They held genealogies, histories, and religious myths. They were the empire's memory. These precious records, particularly those glorifying Huáscar's lineage, were piled high in the central square and set ablaze. The smoke that rose over the city carried with it the ashes of history, a deliberate campaign to ensure that future generations would know only one true Sapa Inca, Atahualpa. While his generals cemented their control, Atahualpa savored his victory in the provincial comfort of Cajamarca. Let us shift our perspective to his mountain court, a place buzzing with the energy of a new dynasty. He was surrounded not by the ancient aristocracy of Cusco, but by the hardened commanders and loyal soldiers who had won him the throne. Messengers arrived daily, bringing news of the successful pacification of the South and tribute from newly compliant provinces. He was the undisputed master of a vast domain, his power extending from the hot jungles of the north to the frozen peaks of the south. He had won the ultimate prize. The Civil War was over. His brother was a non-entity. His capital was secured, and his authority was absolute. The final act of this family tragedy was yet to play out. Huáscar, a king in name only, was marched north from his prison in Cusco, a living trophy for his brother's final inspection. We follow his slow, humiliating journey along the very roads he once commanded. He was forced to travel not on a golden litter, but on foot, bound and weary. He was the ghost at the feast of his brother's triumph, a constant reminder of the old order that had been so violently overthrown. The empire was now truly Atahualpa's. With his domestic enemies utterly crushed and his power base secure, he could finally turn his attention to a minor curiosity his scouts had been reporting for weeks. A small band of peculiar-looking men clad in strange metal had been slowly making their way up into his mountains. The road to Cajamarca was a path paved with shame. For every mile Huáscar traveled, a piece of his divine aura seemed to flake away, left to dissolve in the mountain dust. We are now witness to the final deconstruction of a god. He who had been carried on a golden litter, shielded from the common gaze by feathered fans, now walked with bound hands and a bowed head. Peasants and villagers who once would have prostrated themselves in his presence now peered from their homes with a mixture of pity and fearful curiosity. We see the Son of the Sun not as a celestial being, but as a man, his feet bloody, his fine robes tattered, his eyes fixed on the unforgiving earth. This journey was more than a transfer of a prisoner. It was a traveling spectacle, a moving sermon on the absolute and terrible power of the new Sapa Inca. Let us imagine the scene that awaited him in Cajamarca. Atahualpa was not seated in a palace of ancient stone, but in a sprawling military camp, the epicenter of his power. He was surrounded by thousands of his victorious warriors, the men who had torn an empire in half for him. He sat upon a low golden stool, the emblem of a ruler, exuding an aura of unshakable confidence. He was not dressed for courtly ceremony, but for command, the warrior king in his element. Into this arena of raw power, Huáscar was dragged and thrown to his knees. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the wind. The two brothers, the two poles of a shattered world, finally faced each other. We are observers to a silence that holds the weight of 5 years of bloodshed and a lifetime of rivalry. Atahualpa was the first to speak. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the air with the precision of an obsidian blade. He did not rant or rave. Instead, he lectured, his tone a cold mixture of contempt and paternalistic disappointment. He spoke of Huáscar's arrogance in demanding his presence in Cusco, of his foolishness in trusting incompetent generals, of his weakness in clinging to traditions that could no longer protect him. He gestured to the legions around them, the true source of authority. This, he proclaimed, was the new order. An order built not on dusty mummies and obscure prophecies, but on loyalty forged in battle and power earned by the spear. It was a complete and total repudiation of the world Huáscar had represented. During this calculated monologue, Huáscar remained silent, a statue of defeat. To respond would be to engage, to argue, and to grant his brother the satisfaction of a debate. His silence was the last weapon he possessed, a final, internal fortress of defiance that Atahualpa could not breach. After what must have felt like an eternity, Atahualpa gave a slight flick of his wrist. Huáscar was pulled back to his feet and led away, not to an executioner's block, but to a comfortable, heavily guarded enclosure. Atahualpa was too clever to make him a martyr. A living, humiliated Huáscar was a far more potent symbol of his own supremacy. With his brother finally caged and the empire's silence beneath his boot, the Sapa Inca could now afford to indulge his curiosity about the strange men with hair on their faces. He had conquered his own world. Now he would simply meet the emissaries of another. From his tranquil mountain perch in Cajamarca, Atahualpa could be forgiven for believing he presided over a world reborn. The reports from the south were excellent. Quisquez had pacified the old capital, the last vestiges of Huáscar's authority had been systematically erased, and tribute was once again flowing north. To the victor, the empire looked like a perfectly repaired vessel, its cracked hull mended, its sails full, ready to navigate the future under a new, stronger captain. But let us adjust our focus to pull back from the triumphant king and look instead at the condition of the ship he now commanded. What we see is not a vessel repaired, but a magnificent wreck held together by fear and fresh blood, its structural integrity fatally compromised. The Civil War had inflicted wounds far deeper than the mere loss of soldiers. Let us examine the very arteries of the empire, the great road system. For centuries, this network had been a marvel of unity, a testament to collective effort. Along these paved highways, chasqui runners had carried messages at astonishing speeds, and llamas had transported grain from bountiful provinces to those in need. Now, after a conflict lasting 5 years, these roads told a different story. They were scarred by the passage of armies, their rest stops and storehouses plundered, their bridges deliberately destroyed and hastily rebuilt. We can imagine the chasqui system, once a finely tuned relay of information, now fractured and unreliable, its runners uncertain who to trust. The roads that had once stitched the empire together now served as reminders of the armies that had torn it apart, the paths of commerce transformed into corridors of conquest. The true cost, however, was not measured in broken stones, but in shattered faith. We must understand that for the people of Tawantinsuyu, the Sapa Inca was the center of the universe. The war had presented an impossible choice, 2 suns in the sky, both demanding allegiance. The subsequent purge in Cusco was a theological earthquake. When Atahualpa ordered the mummies of his brother's ancestors to be burned, he was not just destroying bodies, he was incinerating the very fabric of history and belief for half the empire. We are now looking at a population gripped by a profound spiritual crisis. The cosmic order was broken. Farmers tending their terraced fields and weavers at their looms would have looked to the heavens and wondered which gods, if any, were still listening. This internal rot of uncertainty was a far greater vulnerability than any depleted army. In the southern provinces, the resentment was a simmering poison. Atahualpa's northern generals, viewed as foreign conquerors, now governed with an iron fist. The local nobility, the Caracas who formed the essential middle management of the empire, had been decimated. Their replacements were Atahualpa's loyalists, men who did not understand the local customs or command the local respect. We are seeing an empire that is unified in name only. Beneath the surface of enforced compliance lay a landscape of fractured loyalties and a deep yearning for revenge. Entire ethnic groups that had been subjugated by Huáscar's father and then forced to fight for him now found themselves under the heel of a new, even more ruthless master. They were defeated, but they were not broken, and their memories were long. It was into this fragile, traumatized, and deeply divided world that Francisco Pizarro and his 168 men were climbing. Atahualpa, surrounded by his 40,000 elite veterans, saw the approaching Spaniards as a curious sideshow, a minor delegation from some unknown, insignificant tribe. He was a man who had just won a war for control of millions of people across thousands of miles. His mind was occupied with the enormous task of rebuilding a world in his own image. He could not possibly conceive that the greatest threat to his empire was not the ghost of his dead brother, but this tiny, almost laughable procession of bearded men. He watched them come, a conqueror observing a curiosity, utterly blind to the fact that they were not walking into his empire, but into the myriad cracks his own victory had created. While the victor of a continental war consolidated his rule, a very different kind of army was making its presence known. Let us now turn our gaze from the Andean peaks to the humid, sweltering coastline, where a procession that was part expedition, part pirate raid, and part desperate pilgrimage had just made landfall. These were not the emissaries of a great king, nor were they a disciplined imperial force. They were 168 men, a motley collection of adventurers, debtors, and zealots, led by a 62-year-old illiterate swineherd turned soldier of fortune named Francisco Pizarro. We can almost smell the sweat, salt water, and rust that clung to them, a stark contrast to the clean, thin air of Atahualpa's mountain court. They were a microcosm of old-world ambition, hardened by decades of brutal warfare in the Caribbean and Central America, and they had come to this new shore with a singular, blinding purpose: to find and claim the legendary kingdom of gold. Pizarro himself was the very embodiment of the conquistador spirit. He was not a nobleman born to power, but a man who had clawed his way up from nothing, his entire life a testament to ruthless opportunism. He possessed an unshakable belief in his own destiny, a conviction that God had sanctioned his quest for riches. We must understand that for these men, the cross and the sword were inseparable. They genuinely believed they were doing God's work by bringing salvation to the heathen, even as they planned to relieve those same heathens of every ounce of precious metal they owned. Their greatest assets were not their primitive firearms or their 16 horses, which the natives viewed with terrified awe. Their true weapons were a complete lack of scruples, an unreadable foreign psychology, and a strain of desperate courage born from having absolutely nothing to lose. The first reports that reached Atahualpa's ears were filtered through the lens of Inca understanding. His scouts described the strangers with meticulous detail. They spoke of men with hair growing on their faces like wool, who wore shells of shining metal that no club could dent. They marveled at the giant beasts the men rode, creatures that were faster and stronger than any llama. Most terrifying were the thundersticks, the arquebuses, which could spit fire and kill a man from a distance. Here we are now watching a critical failure of imagination. Atahualpa and his generals processed this information, but they could not comprehend its context. They saw strange new tools and animals, not the harbingers of a completely alien concept of warfare, one based on shock, terror, and decisive technological advantage. To them, 168 men, no matter how strange, were not a threat. They were a curiosity. Atahualpa, feeling secure in his power and amused by the reports, gave the strangers permission to advance. It was a decision born of supreme confidence, perhaps even a flicker of boredom. He was the master of 40,000 warriors, the undisputed ruler of millions. What harm could this tiny band of oddities possibly do? He would let them come to him. He would see these bearded men and their giant llamas for himself, and then he would decide their fate. And so Pizarro began his ascent, leading his small, exhausted company up into the vast, unknown mountains of the Inca Empire. We are now following this absurdly small force as it marches deeper and deeper into the heart of a continent, a single drop of poison moving deliberately toward the heart of a wounded giant. The thin Andean air was a thief, stealing the breath from the lungs of men and beasts alike. For Francisco Pizarro and his 168 followers, this ascent was a grueling ordeal, a slow climb into a world that grew stranger and more intimidating with every step. We are now marching alongside them, feeling the burning in our own legs as we navigate the stone-paved roads that clung to the mountainsides, like threads on a giant loom. These roads were a revelation. They were far superior to anything these men had ever seen in Europe, a testament to an engineering prowess that was both humbling and tantalizing. With every perfectly laid stone, the legend of a wealthy, sophisticated empire became terrifyingly real. The gold they sought was not a myth. It was the foundation of the very civilization they intended to plunder. But as they moved deeper into the highlands, Pizarro the soldier began to see something Pizarro the treasure hunter might have missed. He saw abandoned watchtowers and the charred remains of rope bridges. He saw villages where the faces of the people were etched not with awe for the newcomers, but with a deep lingering sorrow and a barely concealed resentment. Let us listen in on the conversations Pizarro and his captains had with local curacas, the provincial leaders. These were the men whose families had served the dynasty in Cusco for generations. Through translators, they spoke not of a unified kingdom, but of a world turned upside down. They spoke of a northern usurper, of a true king held captive, and of a capital city cleansed with the blood of its own nobility. Here, we see the pieces of the puzzle falling into place for the Spanish commander. The great empire of the sun was not a solid block of gold. It was a fractured geode, glittering on the outside, but hollowed out and cracked within. This knowledge transformed Pizarro's expedition from a reckless raid into a calculated psychological operation. We can imagine him in his tent at night, the flicker of a candle illuminating his weathered face as he connected the dots. He had seen this pattern before. He knew the stories of Hernán Cortés in Mexico, who had brilliantly turned the Tlaxcalans against their hated Aztec overlords. The Inca Empire, he realized, was a landscape of simmering hatreds. The southern provinces, loyal to the memory of the murdered Huáscar, were a powder keg waiting for a spark. He and his men would be that spark. Their mission was no longer simply to survive and find gold. The new plan was far more audacious, to present themselves as liberators, as divine avengers arriving to correct a great injustice. With this new strategy solidifying, their march took on a new purpose. They were no longer just intruders, they were actors on a vast political stage, their every move calculated to exploit the existing divisions. They arrived at the ridge overlooking the valley of Cajamarca in the afternoon of November 15th, 1532. The sight that greeted them would have paralyzed lesser men with fear. Spread out below, like a galaxy of campfires and brightly colored tents, was the victorious army of the Sapa Inca. Tens of thousands of elite warriors, the hardened veterans of a brutal 5-year war, filled the valley floor. We are now standing beside Pizarro, looking down at this overwhelming display of military might. His 168 men were a single insignificant speck of dust against this ocean of power. But the old swineherd saw something different. With the knowledge of the empire's broken soul, he saw not an army that would destroy him, but a chessboard perfectly arranged for the single most audacious move in history. The silence among the 168 men was as thin and sharp as the mountain air. Below them, Atahualpa's army was a living constellation, a sea of flickering lights that seemed to mock the very stars. We must now descend from that precarious ridge and enter the Spanish camp, a place not of confidence but of profound, bone-deep terror. These men, hardened by battle and driven by greed, were now confronted with the sheer mathematics of their own insignificance. They listened to the distant sounds of the Inca camp, the drums and the songs of victory, and they understood that a conventional fight would not be a battle, it would be an erasure. That night, prayers were muttered with the fervor of last rites. Men who had not thought of God in years now sought absolution, their confessions whispered into the freezing darkness. Into this crucible of fear stepped Francisco Pizarro. He gathered his captains, his voice a low and steady anchor in the storm of their anxiety. Here we see the illiterate swineherd transform into a master of human psychology. He did not offer false hope or speak of a glorious death. Instead, he laid out a plan of such breathtaking audacity that it bordered on madness. They would not fight the army. They would capture the god. The plan was simple in its concept, yet terrifying in its execution. They would invite Atahualpa into the town of Cajamarca, into its large central square. Then, from the buildings that surrounded it, they would spring a trap. It was an all-or-nothing gamble, a single desperate roll of the dice for the entire continent. To set this trap, Pizarro sent a small delegation led by the dashing Hernando de Soto, his finest horseman. Let us ride with them as they descended into the valley, a tiny island of steel and leather in an ocean of Inca warriors. They were led to Atahualpa, who sat on a golden stool outside his royal tent, surrounded by his wives and commanders. He received them with an air of majestic indifference, his eyes never once lifting to meet theirs. He listened to their invitation through an interpreter, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. To demonstrate the power of his strange beasts, De Soto put his horse through its paces, charging and rearing so close to the Sapa Inca that flecks of foam landed on the royal person. While many of his nobles flinched in terror, Atahualpa remained perfectly still, a statue of absolute authority. Later that day, we learn, he had the men who flinched executed. He agreed to visit Pizarro the following day. He would come, he announced, as a friend with his retinue unarmed to see these peculiar strangers for himself. He believed he was going to a meeting. In reality, he had just accepted an invitation to his own abduction. The morning of November 16th, 1532, dawned cold and clear. The Spanish were in position. We can feel the suffocating tension inside the empty stone buildings surrounding the square. Cavalrymen sat on their horses in darkened halls, the animals' hooves muffled with cloth. Infantrymen with swords and pikes crouched by the doorways, their knuckles white. Pedro de Candia stood by the army's 2 small cannons, a lit match in his hand. The hours crawled by. The sun reached its zenith and began its slow descent toward the western peaks. Atahualpa did not appear. The waiting became an agony, a slow poison of doubt and fear. Was the plan discovered? Would the Inca army now simply surge up the hill and annihilate them? Then, in the late afternoon, the procession began. It was a river of color and sound flowing into the valley. We see thousands of attendants sweeping the road clean before their lord. Dancers and singers announced his divine approach. Finally, carried high on a magnificent litter plated with gold and silver and lined with parrot feathers, came the Sapa Inca himself. Atahualpa entered the square, a vision of absolute power, surrounded by thousands of his nobles and retainers. He surveyed the scene, his brow furrowed in confusion. The square was silent. The buildings were shuttered. The strange bearded men were nowhere to be seen. He was the most powerful man in the world, sitting in the center of an empty stage, and for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty must have crossed his mind. He called out, his voice echoing in the unnerving quiet, demanding to know where the foreigners were hiding. The answer to Atahualpa's call was not a voice, but a cannon shot. From the shadows of the silent buildings, a single plume of white smoke erupted, and with it, the apocalypse was unleashed upon the unarmed Inca nobility. We are now in the very heart of the maelstrom. The Spanish cavalry, a terrifying fusion of man and beast, charged into the crowded square. The sound of their war cry, "Santiago!" mixed with the shriek of terrified people and the clang of steel on unsuspecting flesh. The Inca nobles, products of a world where warfare had rules and rituals, were completely unprepared for this kind of total, unrestrained slaughter. They formed a human wall around their emperor's litter, a desperate, tragic shield of bodies, trying to stop cannonballs and steel blades with their bare hands. Here we witness the single-minded focus of Francisco Pizarro himself. While his men carved a bloody path through the square, he and a small group of soldiers fought their way directly toward the royal litter. He was not interested in the massacre, he was interested in the prize. He reached the golden palanquin, grabbed the Sapa Inca by his royal tunic, and dragged the son of the sun from his celestial perch down into the blood-soaked earth. The moment Atahualpa touched the ground, the battle was effectively over. The Inca warriors outside the town, thousands upon thousands of them, stood paralyzed. We must try to comprehend their shock. Their god, the center of their cosmos, had been snatched from the sky by a handful of violent, hairy men. The army was a body without a head, a giant rendered inert, unable to process what it had just seen. As night fell, a stunned silence replaced the sounds of slaughter. Atahualpa, stripped of his divine regalia, was now a prisoner in a stone room, the same room from which his captors had launched their ambush. Let us now observe the first interaction between the two worlds, not on a battlefield, but in a prison cell. Atahualpa was not a broken man. He was an emperor, a strategist, and a keen observer of human nature. He watched his captors with a cold, analytical gaze. He saw the way their eyes lit up when they handled his golden drinking vessels. He saw them squabble over a silver ornament. He quickly understood that these were not gods, nor were they soldiers in the way he understood the term. They were driven by a singular obsessive hunger for the yellow and white metals that his people used for mere decoration. It was in this moment of dawning realization that the Sapa Inca made his own audacious gamble. Standing in the middle of the room, he reached up and made a mark on the wall as high as his hand could stretch. We are now inside the mind of a king, trying to buy back his world. Through an interpreter, he made a proposal that must have sounded like a fable to the assembled Spaniards. He would fill the room, he said, to the height of that mark, one time with gold. And the two smaller adjoining rooms, he promised, he would fill 2 times over with silver. For Pizarro and his men, who had risked everything for a fraction of such a treasure, This was an offer beyond the scope of mortal dreams. It was the wealth of a continent, the ransom of a god, offered up with the calm confidence of a man who believed he was simply negotiating the price of his own release. He had just presented the keys to his empire's treasury, convinced that these strange, greedy men could be bought and sent away. Pizarro's men looked from the mark on the wall to the Sapa Inca and back again, their minds struggling to process a scale of wealth that bordered on the divine. We see the birth of a legend in real time, the myth of El Dorado crystallizing in the greedy eyes of 168 desperate men. The offer was insane, impossible, yet the calm authority with which it was delivered gave it a terrifying weight. For Francisco Pizarro, this was the moment his entire life, a long and brutal climb from poverty, had been leading to. He accepted. The agreement was made, a promise between a captive god and his mortal jailers, a contract that would now set the entire empire into motion for a purpose its people could never have imagined. The command went out from Cajamarca, a strange new decree from a king in chains. Let us follow the ripples of this order as they spread along the Inca road network. Messengers, once runners of war, now became couriers for the greatest treasure hunt in history. The command was simple: strip the empire of its finery. From the Sun Temple in Cusco, priests tearfully removed the great golden plates that lined its sacred walls, each one representing a ray of their captured deity. From palaces and shrines across the land, governors oversaw the collection of golden goblets, silver statues, and intricate jewelry, pieces that were not currency, but embodiments of divine power and ancestral memory. We can picture the long caravans of llamas, their backs laden not with grain or textiles, but with the very soul of the kingdom, all of it flowing in a steady, glittering river toward a small stone room in the northern mountains. In his captivity, Atahualpa was transformed. He was no longer just an emperor. He became an object of intense fascination. We are now observers of a strange and intimate political theater. He spent his days learning to play chess with his captors, quickly mastering the game's complex strategies. He maintained his court, receiving his generals and issuing commands with an authority that his chains could not diminish. He studied the Spaniards, learning their customs, their hierarchies, and their profound weaknesses. He was playing a long game, convinced that once their lust for metal was sated, these crude, hairy men would take their treasure and vanish, leaving him to rule the world he had rightfully won. But another captive, hundreds of miles to the south, saw the situation very differently. Huáscar, being marched north by Atahualpa's generals, heard the whispers of what was happening in Cajamarca. For him, these strange invaders were not a nuisance to be bought off. They were a potential lifeline, a chaotic force that could upend the new order. Here, we witness a fatal miscalculation, a final desperate move in the brothers' war. Managing to get a message to Pizarro's camp, Huáscar made a counteroffer. He claimed that Atahualpa, the usurper from the north, knew nothing of the true wealth of the empire. He, the legitimate Sapa Inca, could offer them far more. He could fill that room not once, but multiple times over. He appealed to their greed, hoping to turn them into his own private army. The news of this second, even richer potential prize reached Atahualpa's ears almost immediately. We can imagine the cold dread that must have settled upon him. His brother, the ghost he thought he had vanquished, was now attempting to outbid him for his own life from a prison cell. He realized instantly that a living Huáscar was no longer just a symbol of his victory. He was a rival, a complication, a loose thread that could unravel his entire strategy. With the Spaniards now aware of another claimant to the throne, one who was promising them even more wealth, Atahualpa's own value as a prisoner plummeted. From his gilded cage in Cajamarca, the Sapa Inca sent a final secret order. The message was carried south, a quiet death sentence whispered from one loyal commander to the next. Not long after, on a desolate stretch of road, Huáscar, the last Sapa Inca of the old Cusco dynasty, was taken to a riverbank and drowned. His death was the final bloody punctuation mark on the Civil War, a murder committed to secure a promise made to men who had no concept of honor. The news of Huáscar's watery demise, intended to secure Atahualpa's position, instead sealed his fate. It arrived in the Spanish camp not as a whisper, but as a political thunderclap, a perfect justification wrapped in the guise of moral outrage. Here we see the brutal calculus of conquest in its purest form. The Spanish, who had stood by while a king arranged his brother's murder, now had a righteous cause. Atahualpa was no longer a captive monarch to be ransomed. He was a fratricidal tyrant, a convenient monster whose death could be framed as an act of justice. The murder of Huáscar did not remove Atahualpa's rival. It simply removed his last shred of value as a bargaining chip. Meanwhile, the river of gold and silver reached its high tide. We must imagine the scene as the last of the treasure was brought into Cajamarca. The ransom room was not just full, it was overflowing, a mountain of intricate artwork, religious icons, and royal regalia. Blacksmiths worked day and night, melting down centuries of irreplaceable Inca artistry into crude, transportable ingots of raw metal, a process that was as much a cultural annihilation as it was a financial transaction. The promise had been kept. The treasure was so immense it defied belief, yet its presence created an unbearable tension. With the deal fulfilled, the question hung in the air, heavy and sharp. What now? For the soldiers, especially the newly arrived reinforcements under Diego de Almagro, who had missed the initial capture, a living Atahualpa was a terrifying liability. He was the one man who could, with a single word, summon the legions still waiting in the hills and wipe them from existence. A faction led by Hernando de Soto argued for honor. They were soldiers, they claimed, and a deal was a deal. The emperor should be sent to Spain to be judged by their own king. But they were overruled by the forces of fear and pragmatism. Pizarro, a man who had never let sentiment interfere with survival, knew that releasing Atahualpa was unthinkable. And so, a stage was set for one of history's most cynical legal proceedings. We are now witness to the theater of the absurd, where a sovereign monarch was judged by foreign bandits for the customs of his own civilization. A list of 12 charges was drawn up. Atahualpa stood accused of idolatry, of practicing polygamy, and, most hypocritically of all, of assassinating his brother Huáscar. The trial was a farce. The interpreter, a local man named Felipillo, who held a personal grudge against the emperor, deliberately twisted Atahualpa's testimony, transforming his defiant defense into a confession of conspiracy. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. On the evening of July 26, 1533, Atahualpa was sentenced to be burned at the stake. We must understand the profound terror of this sentence. For an Inca, preservation of the body was essential for the journey into the afterlife. To be burned was to be utterly annihilated, erased from the cosmic cycle for all eternity. It was a fate worse than 1,000 deaths. As he was tied to the stake in the center of the same square where he had been captured, a final, terrible negotiation took place. The Dominican friar, Vicente de Valverde, offered the Sapa Inca a final choice. If he would renounce his gods and accept baptism as a Christian, he would be granted the mercy of a quicker, less spiritually destructive death by strangulation. Faced with the choice between oblivion and survival in the next world, Atahualpa relented. A bowl of water was brought. He was christened Francisco, taking the name of the very man who had orchestrated his doom. Moments later, the iron collar of the garrote was tightened around his neck. The god-king, the son of the sun, the victor of the civil war and ruler of millions, was strangled to death in the cold mountain darkness. They had decapitated an empire, and in the silence that followed, they were left alone with the twitching of its corpse. The execution of a god-king does not bring silence. It creates a vacuum, a roaring void that pulls all certainty and order into itself. In the stunned aftermath of Atahualpa's death, we see Francisco Pizarro and his men standing not as triumphant conquerors, but as terrified arsonists who have just burned down a cathedral and are now left wondering if the entire city will catch fire. They possessed a king's ransom in gold, but they were a tiny, hated island of foreigners in a vast and now leaderless ocean of millions. The real conquest of the Inca Empire was only just beginning, and it would be won not with cannons, but with the cynical mastery of a political game the Inca had taught them how to play. Here we see Pizarro, the pragmatist, making his next brilliant move. He understood that he could not rule this empire directly. He needed a native face, a symbol of continuity that would lend a veneer of legitimacy to his occupation. He found it in Tupac Hualpa, a younger brother of the murdered Huáscar. The Spaniards crowned him the new Sapa Inca in a hastily arranged ceremony, a piece of political theater designed for the southern provinces. They were not conquerors, they presented, but restorers of the rightful order, avengers of the legitimate dynasty. With their new puppet monarch in tow, they began the long and perilous march south to the imperial heart, to the golden city of Cusco. They were following the path of a civil war, and they intended to walk it all the way to the throne. But Atahualpa's ghost still commanded armies. His most loyal general, the fearsome Quizquiz, was still in control of Cusco. He was a battle-hardened commander who had no illusions about the bearded men. He saw them not as divine avengers, but as treacherous murderers, and he was not about to hand over his master's capital to them and their puppet king. As the Spanish column snaked its way through the mountain passes, it was not met with cheering crowds, but with a series of brutal, desperate ambushes. Let us follow their progress, a slow grind through hostile territory. Inca warriors, masters of the high-altitude terrain, rained boulders down upon them and contested every narrow bridge. In these skirmishes, we witnessed the terrifying effectiveness of the Spanish cavalry charge on open ground, but also the sheer suicidal bravery of Inca soldiers who would throw themselves at the horses, trying to pull the strange beasts and their riders down. It was in these battles that the true poison of the Civil War worked its magic for the Spanish. In the provinces that had been loyal to Huáscar, the local populations rose up to help the invaders. They provided the Spaniards with food, intelligence on Quizquiz's movements, and thousands of their own warriors who were eager for a chance to exact revenge on Atahualpa's northern legions. We are now witness to the final tragic act of the War of the Two Brothers, with Inca fighting Inca, only this time for the benefit of a foreign power. Pizarro did not need to conquer a united empire. He merely had to tip the scales in a conflict that was still raging, a fire that was more than happy to consume itself. After a series of bloody engagements, Quizquiz's forces were finally broken outside the capital. The path to Cusco was open. In November of 1533, the Spanish entered the sacred city not as invaders, but as the honored guests of the Cusco nobility, hailed as the liberators who had overthrown the usurper's regime. But the celebration was short-lived. Once inside the city's walls, the liberators revealed their true faces. The The sacred Coricancha was systematically violated, its last golden treasures pried from the walls with crowbars. Mummies of ancient kings were desecrated in a frenzied search for hidden trinkets. The sack of Cusco was a final brutal violation, a conquest not of an army, but of a soul. In the end, the great Inca Empire was not truly conquered by 168 Spaniards. It committed suicide. The Civil War was the mortal wound. Pizarro and his men were merely the infection that consumed the corpse. They were brilliant opportunists who walked through a door the two warring brothers had kicked wide open for them. A sobering reminder that the most formidable walls are not made of stone, but of unity. It leaves us with a haunting question, one that echoes through the centuries. Had the two brothers stood together, could their united empire have driven the handful of invaders back into the sea? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And to ensure you don't miss our next journey into the most critical mistakes in history, make sure you subscribe and ring that notification bell.